Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and this shall be a short video because, well, I made a longer video, but for whatever reason, Audacity made it unreadable, and therefore I have to re-record it. Which was odd, because you could still see the lines and the wave patterns, but when I hit play so I could review what I had recorded so far, it sent an error message and I just couldn't get it to work. So I am starting over, but it will be about a different topic. I will try again later on the topic I actually wanted to talk about, simply because, well, I don't have as much time to record this. As I record this, I am preparing to leave my house and go back to civilization where there's internet so that I can load this online. But nevertheless, I want to keep this channel alive, even though it is a meager channel that never had much following, mainly because it was taken from me once. And while the powers that be are less willing to suppress certain speech these days, it is nevertheless obvious that they are still a bit censorious and that they are rather uncomfortable with certain points of view. Though the way they handle it is different. Depending upon the size of your audience, you can offset the negative effects of their ire, because they do still want to make money and gain viewership, even if they want to delegitimize your views. So the larger you are, the easier it is to evade certain problems, although you can never get away with them completely. People on the left, people who are militant atheists or socialists or other far left-wingers, have a far easier time on this Schwarmplat than do anyone who's right-wing and conservative. And my views are well outside the mainstream, but I'm still generally slotted into the conservative type, which means as far as they're concerned, I'm an activist and a socialist for nationalism and all that. I worship the painter man from Austria. I don't really, of course, but this is a platform that makes it rather obvious that they're not interested in a diversity of views. The company is run by left-wingers. That's also why I speak with a bit of a stutter and slur my speech a bit, because it helps avoid dissection from the intelligence synthetica, which is also why I call it things like intelligence synthetica, or talk about Austrian painter man, or things like that. Because when I use the correct terms, I subject myself to undue attention and undue penalty. But therein lies the point, and it was actually the subject of the video that I attempted to make and will remake later. It's fairly obvious that there has been a cultural shift lately away from the progressive side, more to the right-wing side, and I'm a bit ambivalent about this change, because even though I'm not a progressive or even an old-style liberal, I don't even call myself a classical liberal. I do find that the trends on what we call the right are still problematic. Not for the reasons that people on the left do, though. People on the left see everyone on the right, regardless of their actual positions, as socialists for nationalism. They see them as worshipping painter man from Austria. And that just is very easy to do. It's easier to call everyone a factualist than it is to actually deal with their positions. And to be clear, my positions are much more unusual than the modern political discourse typically makes it. I am a monarchist, and I'm not just a monarchist who wants to preserve the existing monarchy as it is. I think that there should be an actual executive monarch, and even people on the right don't really get past that point. They just point to King Charles and talk about how he's a globalist and act as if this matters. They don't seem to mind supporting republicanism and even talk about how King Charles could face a revolution in 1776 for Britain, and that he should remember his namesake King Charles I, and we should do to King Charles III the same thing that happened to Charles I. Just off with his head and have a republic instead. And they don't really grasp that having a republic is not going to get rid of wokeness. Having a republic will in fact make wokeness worse. Because at the end of the day, the people who are promoting the progressive agenda are not monarchists. They are people who imagine a democratic socialist future. And while people on the right will sometimes characterize globalism as a neo-monarchism and follow Alex Jones and say it was created by monarchists who, after the American Revolution, the world started seeing the light of liberty and monarchies started to fall, and wishing to retain their power, they took off their crowns and pretended to give the people the power whilst trying to build a new monarchy and all that. It really isn't. There's much more to monarchism than just having inherited power, and ultimately the thinking of the globalist isn't, well, republicanism and democracy are rising, the power of the people are rising, how do we gain control over them and make them serfs again? That isn't the thinking of them. They're actually people who think that they are promoting democracy. Whether or not they actually are is irrelevant. The beliefs that drive globalism are the beliefs in things like universal human rights, and an idea that the more advanced a society becomes, the less religious it becomes, and the more secular it becomes. They have an idea of what that perfected humanity looks like in that perfected utopia, and they're trying to shepherd humanity to its inevitable fate because they see it as the march of progress. Because even though they've embraced materialism and secularism and reject religion and are atheistic, which isn't to say that they're all explicitly atheists, but many of them are. In fact, most of them are. And even the ones that aren't tend to at least operate on these same material grounds. They tend to view history as this inevitable march, and historically they justify it as if it was a scientific law that predicted human behavior going this way, but really it's rather silly to think history has a definitive pathway to go. But this idea that history has a way to go, it's the Whig view of history, that we go from primitive hunter-gatherers to earlier societies, to early farmlands, to barbarian warlords, to more refined monarchies, to an age of struggle against tyranny of monarchy, and an age of the birth of liberty, and then an early struggle with early democratic forms, until finally we have a liberal, democratic, secular future. It's the mythos that drives them. And it's interesting that it's a mythos, because even though we classify people like this as non-religious, we see them as secular, in reality they are religious. In fact, everyone really is. Because there's more to religion than just believing in gods and supernatural powers. And most people who criticize religion do so less on the basis of thinking a god or gods exist and supernatural powers exist, but on the moralities and traditions that it promotes, and claims that it promotes tribalism. And they claim that they're trying to transcend that. And the whole point of going against religion or promoting secularism, where either religion dies so reason can prevail, or we allow religion to exist so long as it's under secularism and is purely private, is based on this idea that religion has this inherent negative trait that either wholly defines it or else mitigates any good religion does, or else could at best be contained so that this doesn't happen. So we need secularism to protect us from it and give us a fair world, an equitable world. And what actually ends up happening in a secular society isn't setting up a government in which religion and government are kept separate, and the government is neutral towards religion. It never is neutral. it always gets engaged in the same topics that religion does. And that's because ultimately religion is not just belief in God and the supernatural. Religion is a series of moral codes. It's an understanding of the world. It's an understanding of meaning and purpose. Religion ultimately encompasses the entirety of human experience, and that's because religion is a scaffolding on which we use to understand the world around us. And while people will say that I'm confusing religion for worldview, and what I'm discussing is actually worldview, and you can have a worldview without having a religion, I would like to point out that the concept of having a worldview is itself a new concept. People in the ancient world did not speak of their worldview independent of their religion. Neither did people in the Middle Ages or even the early modern period. The very concept of having a worldview goes back to about 20th century, I believe. It definitely doesn't go back to before the 19th century, but I think it's a 20th century idea. And the only reason worldview exists as a concept is because people noticed that even the ardently secular still end up gravitating around certain premises and presuppositions and start teaching other people how they do things and how we need an understanding of the world. And yet at the same time, we had people fiercely insisting that they oppose religion. They are not religious people. At the very least, we had people saying, I am not religious. Don't call me religious. It's actually offensive to call me religious. I am going to prove that you can be a good person without religion. I'm going to prove you can live your life without religion. But then they ended up constructing these philosophical outlooks that took the place of religion. And ultimately, we came up with this idea that everyone has a worldview, but not everyone has a religion. And some people's worldview is a religious worldview, and other people have a secular worldview. But in reality, this needlessly complicates things, while at the same time flattening and oversimplifying what religion is. One of the problems that I've noticed in the modern world is that people will talk about religion as this abstract thing that nevertheless has definitive traits to it, that people who follow religion are X, Y, and Z, and at the same time, that's obviously not true. Religion is a collection of beliefs, practices, and moral ideas. It is not one thing, and it's not even one type of thing. And the alternatives to religion don't just fill the same function of religion, they behave like religion, even though we're told that because they're not religion, they're not the same. And of course, we have people coming up with ways that they really are, like saying religion is based on faith, whilst secular beliefs are based on reason, which automatically assumes that faith and reason are antonyms. And we justify that by defining faith as believing something without evidence. But faith was never understood as belief without evidence historically. Faith means confidence or trust. And ultimately, you won't find historical people saying that religion is based on faith. That's another modern idea. Rather, historically, we understood that people put their faith in a religion that they already agreed to. The act of faith is an act of agreeing with what the religion teaches. But the foundation of the religion itself is not faith. The foundation of one's personal allegiance to the religion is not faith. Faith is the final culmination rather than the starting point. Today we've inverted that and say that religion is based on faith when it really isn't. And at the same time, religion is certainly not based on believing things with no evidence. You can't base belief on belief. And if we define faith as belief without evidence, it's silly to say that my religious beliefs are based on belief without evidence, because you're saying belief is based on belief. Whether or not there's evidence, that's just nonsense. And I know a lot of militant atheists say, well, that's the point, religion is nonsense. But you don't really seem to grasp what I'm saying if you do that. And of course, militant atheists will always intentionally misrepresent what I'm saying. For example, I'm certain many militant atheists will say that my position is that atheism is a religion. I've had that said about me for years. In reality, I don't think that atheism is a religion, but I do think that every atheist that I talk to is religious. But they act as if those are contradictory terms, as if I'm saying, on the one hand, atheism isn't a religion, but then I turn around and say, atheism is a religion. In fact, I've constantly mocked for that and called a liar and ridiculed, and someone even made a video about me holding me up for shame and ridicule. A video that I could not respond to because my channel was threatened with deletion if I did. But therein lies the point. My actual position is not addressed. Rather, they know that religious people will often call atheism a religion. They will even often say that the reason they do this is to drag atheism down to the level of religion, as if religion is lower than atheism. Which itself doesn't make sense, because they define atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God and say we're all born atheists and all that. Atheism can't be higher than religion. Even if religion is wrong and we shouldn't be religious, it would still be higher than atheism, because it takes more mental thought to believe in something that you lack belief in, starting out with complete ignorance. Of course, atheism isn't really a lack of belief in a God. Anthony Flew made that definition up in the 1970s. Modern atheists would say he didn't, and they have quotes to prove earlier atheists defined faith as belief without evidence, like Charles Bradlaugh and Robert Ingersoll and Bertrand Russell. But you will find that quote mining amongst modern-day militant atheists is really an exercise in forcing meaning onto a previous quote that it never really had, and pretending it's the obvious meaning that the quote has always had, when, if not framed that way, if you're not primed to accept that that is the reading you should have, they don't actually say that. For example, prior to Anthony Flew, you will never find an atheist saying atheism is a lack of belief in a God. You'll find people like Charles Bradlaugh saying that he doesn't even know what the word God means, but you won't find someone saying, I lack belief in a God. We instead have a situation where we spent years having it hammered home and pounded into our head that atheism is just a lack of belief in a God, so that it may seem natural for us to see a quote by Charles Bradlaugh saying that he doesn't even know what the word God means and say, oh, he's expressing his lack of belief. But it isn't what the text obviously says. And what's more, I've actually read Charles Bradlaugh's theological essays, which is one of the main sources for the new atheism. The new atheism never came up with anything new. It just repeated old arguments. About the only thing it really contributed was coming up with an excuse for why communism had nothing to do with atheism, therefore atheism is innocent, which is a lie, of course. Communism had everything to do with atheism, but the point being made is that when Charles Bradlaugh said he doesn't even know what the word God means, he wasn't saying, I lack belief in a God. He was saying that the idea of God is incoherent and was arguing against the existence of God. He was doing the exact opposite of what modern atheists do when they define atheism as a lack of belief in a God. The modern atheist defines atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God in order to say that they have made no claims and have no burden of proof. Then after they've defined atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and from that definition established that atheists aren't claiming that God doesn't exist and therefore have no burden of proof, and that the sole burden of proof is on the theist, will proceed to call God an imaginary character. They'll bemoan that grown adults still have an imaginary friend and how tragic religion is and how it poisons the mind. And they will talk about God as a fictional character in a badly written fantasy novel and the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, as Dawkins said. And they'll outright call people delusional for believing in God. They will call God a delusion. Richard Dawkins even wrote a book called The God Delusion. They go out of their way to say that God is not real, that God does not exist, that no God exists, that gods are the figments of human imaginations, that we are all born atheists, and we only start believing in gods because we are indoctrinated by religion. And the word indoctrinate, of course, has negative connotations today. It basically means the same thing as being brainwashed. So we're born innocent atheist babies, and we're brainwashed into religion before we learn critical thinking, and that's the only reason we believe in sky fairies. which is another way that they insult God. They compare God to sky fairies. They call God a sky fairy, or a sky wizard, or a sky daddy. They'll compare God to a flying spaghetti monster, and and they even have a fake religion, Pastafarianism, and that prayer that they like laughing at as a joke. May his noodly opinions bless you. Ramen. Ha ha ha, isn't it funny? Well, God's no more plausible than a flying spaghetti monster. And it's obvious that they are making the claim that God does not exist, that it is a self-evident fact that God doesn't exist, that all rational people recognize that God does not exist, and people who believe in God have something mentally wrong with them. While at the same time insisting they're not making any of those claims, they merely lack belief because the word atheism is defined as a lack of belief in a God. They are atheists, therefore you must apply the definition to them. And it's rather irritating when they do that, because they're acting as if defining the word atheism as a lack of belief in a God instantaneously means that the real people calling people delusional for believing in a magical sky wizard have not made a claim and have no burden of proof. Then again, these are the same atheists who will also use the idea that they can't prove a negative is somehow also a way of getting out of the burden of proof, when it really isn't. Especially considering the same atheists will spend years criticizing religion for making unfalsifiable claims and say that that's a problem with religion and what makes it irrational. That people will believe without evidence because it's based on faith. Belief without evidence. It's irrational. Religion is full of unfalsifiable claims, therefore must be rejected. But atheism is an unfalsifiable claim. They claim that God doesn't exist, and then if you demand evidence, they'll either insist that you accept that they merely lack belief, or they'll say that, well, you can't prove a negative. And they'll actually go out of their way to say that they'll make a joke on, how can you prove that something doesn't exist? That's just crazy. Proving something does exist can happen, but how do you expect me to prove that a God doesn't exist? Ahoy! And they'll actually act as if saying that proves that they have no burden of proof, when in reality, it doesn't prove that. Even accepting their premise that you cannot prove a negative, and that their statement that God does not exist has no evidence to back it up, that does not follow, then, that they have no burden of proof. It just means that they have made an unfalsifiable claim. It doesn't mean that they have made no claim at all, that as atheists they merely lack belief, therefore they don't have to prove anything. They still have the burden of proof, they just admitted that they can't fulfill it. It's rather like buying something on credit when you don't have enough money in your bank account. The idea that because the atheists cannot prove something is not true, this means that they have no burden of proof, is absurd. But therein lies the point. A lot of modern discourse on this topic is based on word games. And we don't look at what's really happening. In the modern world, where we see secularism being promoted, we don't see neutrality toward religion. We see a certain specific set of beliefs being imposed on people, whether they believe them or not, in the hopes that all of society will eventually accept this as normative, and that any opposition will fade away and hopefully go away completely, but even if it doesn't, will be isolated in small pockets in homes and churches proverbially, but have no social impact. This is in fact explicitly stated by people like Yuval Noah Harari in his book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He was another bought and paid for atheist because, let's face it, the modern atheist movement and all of these intellectuals and even the new atheism itself were never organic. It was never this group of individuals with no connections to each other writing books and becoming popular on their own just because society was so thirsty for what they said. They were amplified by a publishing industry that was already supportive of them. All four of the horsemen of the new atheism had the same literary agent, John Brockman, who was well established in the publishing world. And there's only 5 major publishers in the United States. I think there may have been 7 or 8 in 2006, but they've consolidated and there's only 5 now. And they're all run by similar people. And keep in mind, all of them belong to intra-related or even the same atheist organizations. For example, Christopher Hitchens was an American citizen. He was born in Britain, but he did acquire American citizenship. And he was part of American Atheists. He was also part of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the American Humanist Association, the Council for Secular Humanism, which of course later merged with the Center for Inquiry, it later merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, which became the Center for Inquiry. And all of these are, by the way, 501c3 tax-exempt atheist organizations. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because Sam Harris got his money for his neuroscience degree that he got in a rather shady way, but we'll discuss that in another video, from Project Reason, which was a secular humanist organization that, when it folded, gave all of its money to the American Humanist Association, and Sam Harris is a member of the American Humanist Association, just like Hitchens was. He was also a member of American Atheist, and still is, I believe. He was a supporter of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and several other atheist groups. So was Daniel Dennett. And Richard Dawkins was a member of the British Humanist Association, which is the original Humanist Association. The American Humanist Association is the American version of it, and they hold shared events and conferences. All of them had already attended similar secularist and secular humanist events and conferences and held awards together. And they were all also tied to the Edge Foundation, which was founded by John Brockman. And there was an intellectual circle that wanted to push something called the New Humanism, which Brockman also helped orchestrate, if not originate. I think he may have originated it. And it was all funded by a man whose name I also can't mention on this channel, but I shall call him Jack Epstein. I think people know who I mean because the name is very similar to the real one. But Jack Epstein funded the New Atheism. He was also receiving funding from various secularist organizations and other organizations that aren't explicitly humanist, but who nevertheless, if you read their papers, are pushing for humanism. And things like UNESCO, which are actually explicitly humanist if you read its documents, but don't advertise that fact. They were founded by Julian Huxley specifically to promote a universal global humanism. And therein lies the point. Modern monarchs, like Charles III, don't behave the way they do because they are monarchists, because they're monarchs trying to preserve the power of monarchy, but because they want to be modern and preserve whatever personal power they have when monarchy falls. Groups like the Fabian Society are actually pushing secularism. They're actually pushing humanism, and they're trying to form this new democratic world, a world in which King Charles and the other monarchs, as powerless as they are for the most part in this modern world, they still have a modicum of power and respectability, have no real place in. The Fabian Society is already working towards abolishing the House of Lords and creating an elected Senate because of democracy, for example. And they've already abolished the last remaining hereditary peers. It's only a matter of time before they seek to disestablish the church, and after they disestablish the church, to abolish the monarchy. And Charles knows this. So, having grown up and been educated in the modern world and hearing about liberal secular democracy and the way of the future and how it's inevitable, he doesn't want to be just swept aside. He's not someone trying to hold on to monarchical power, though. He is someone who's trying to ride the wave of liberal secular democracy and be one of the shepherds, leading us, perhaps as an enlightened monarch who will finally realize it's time for humanity to grow up and grow beyond monarchy and let go of his power nobly and become a voice for democratic power. But really, it's about trying to fit into the modern liberal democratic order, not about monarchy. So when I tell people I'm a monarchist, I don't mean that I support Charles III specifically, and I don't support what's happening with him and everything he's doing. But just because I don't like what Charles III is doing doesn't mean I'm going to say, well, I guess monarchy is evil. We're going to be a republic. Because what good would being a republic be? We have this weird idea in America that if there was a 1776 for Britain and a revolution happened and the monarchy was overthrown and we could just install an American-style constitution and have instead of having a United Kingdom of Great Britain, we would have a United Republic of Great Britain. Of course, most Americans actually think of it as England. It would be the Republic of England instead of the Kingdom of England, and Charles would be ousted as the King of England. They don't seem to realize there's a United Kingdom. But in reality, it would go from being the United Kingdom of Great Britain to the United Republic of Great Britain under a president elected by we the people who finally are liberated from the tyranny of monarchy. And once that happens, we'll have a conservative government and we'll get rid of the wokeness and we'll get rid of the progressivism. Because the one thing the neo-monarchist progressives hate is we the people, and by having a republic, we'll be free. Many people in America even point to the situation in Britain today and say, this is why the founding fathers broke from Britain. The tyranny Britain is under today is the same as it was in the 18th century, and America's founding fathers realized that, broke from it, and gave the power to the people. Monarchy was retained in Britain, and that's why it's woke. And they don't seem to understand that wokeness actually originated with the Enlightenment, which gave rise to the American Republic. A Republic of Britain would not get rid of wokeness, it would encourage it. Because ultimately the progressives do not want neo-monarchism where they're the aristocracy and we're all serfs with no rights. They want a liberal democratic order, just one in which we are all conditioned by liberal secular values. Because they actually think holding right-wing and conservative views are anti-democratic, which is how they justify going against them. They don't view themselves as aristocrats and kings. They view themselves as shepherds ushering in an inevitable secular future that will be a utopia. And that's what makes them dangerous. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.